This position was upheld in 2009 in a report published by the United Nations on climate problems, where the person, the United Nations official, a Chinese official, who signed off on the report as an undersecretary, actually said the climate crisis is the result of very uneven pattern of economic development that evolved over the past 2 centuries, which allowed today's rich countries to attain their current levels of income, in part through not having to account for the environmental damage now threatening the lives and livelihood of others. In other words, the climate justice position, out of which has come this question of per capita, calculation of per capita emissions, is, even though they don't say it, is really a story that we know of European or Western imperialism, or at least Western selfishness over, he says, 200 years, last 500 years, and the whole point is that the climate crisis is something that can be read in terms of unequal relationships between nations. Now that, I'm calling it a historiography because even though these people are not historians, they're actually telling us a history. And that history concerns at the most the last 500 years of the world. Actually less than that, because it goes back to the use of fossil fuels. That history, fundamentally when you read through the book, you realize that there's a lot of third worldism in that position. So actually it's very interesting how the book came to be written. It came to be written because in 1991, the World Resources Institute in America, Gus Fred, an Yale academic who was then the director of World Resources Institute, put forward a booklet about the climate crisis and saying that it must produce a one world out of our differences because this is a crisis challenging every human being. And therefore there must be some kind of global unity of human beings on the question of climate change. And the booklet that Narayan and Agarwal produced was directly a response to this book by saying that this one-worldism now being called for by Western academics and Western policymakers was a fig leaf to cover up the truth of the injustice between nations. That is also part of climate change, because this problem has come about because of the Western nations using up the given available carbon sinks that the planet makes available to us. So it was against this, what they called a phony first world one worldism. It's against this phony claim that they put forward, fundamentally a recycled theory of imperialism or a recycled theory of unequal relationship between nations, to argue that the only just way to deal with the remaining available space that human beings have for economic development, for the use of the carbon sinks, was to distribute the question of greenhouse gases on a per capita basis. And actually on their calculations, the possibility of creating a just world out of this unjust crisis of climate change was passed in 1986, in 1996, by their account. On the other side, you have, so what I'm saying is on the one side you have a story about climate change, which is a story about justice, which is a story actually about unequal relationships between nations. And in that sense, it is a version, one might say, of familiar stories about expansion of the West and its imperialistic nature of it, and the imperialistic nature of that expansion. On the other hand, so to come back to this, I say that, and therefore I should end by saying that the climate justice position, as I said, goes back to third worldism of the 1960s, and that's very clear that in the statement that Agarwal and Narayan actually make in their reading, where they say the rich and powerful consumers of the world should pay the true cost of their consumption. And then they say that is not an economic issue, but an intensely political one. And the leadership for this politics, in their view, required a united bloc of the leaders of the third world nations. And then they said instead of the West's high-sounding but as yet hypocritical, I'm quoting, one worldism, and I'm not quoting now, third world leaders should present the world with their own agenda and look for allies in the West. One could say in parenthesis that much of the recent climate change policy debates, at least in India, vis-a-vis Copenhagen and then Cancun conferences, revolved implicitly actually around this very interesting question of the extent to which India and China could continue to play the third world card, while also claiming to be major players in the global economy, and ignoring effectively the precarious situations in which smaller nations like the Maldives or Western Samoa find themselves. But that's to one side. I'm simply saying that if you look at the debate, I'm trying to present the debate as a debate about historiography, at least two versions of human history. One version is fundamentally telling us a story that is not unknown, which is the story of unequal relationship between nations, between peoples, between classes, and in some ways it's a version, I'm saying, of the historiography of Western imperialism. So if the climate justice position assimilates itself to narratives critical of European imperialism that have been around for the major part of the last 100 years, the climate scientists view anthropogenic global warming in a historical context that requires them both to expand the time scale and to appeal for solution to a general sense of humanity, the kind of one-worldism that actually elicits skeptical responses from the scholars of the climate justice position. So I'm saying, if on the one hand you have this familiar history, then on the other hand, climate scientists are telling us another history. And as I said in the beginning, what got me interested in this story, in the story that climate scientists tell, is precisely the fact that it's a story about human history. It's not a story about natural climate change. That's what I found fascinating about their story. But because of their methods, for one thing, paleoclimatologists have to be knowledgeable about the much longer history and pattern of warming and cooling of the planet to be reasonably certain that the current warming is indeed anthropogenic in nature. So their methods require them to know previous histories of climate change in order to be able to say that this one is human-induced. Secondly, they also see the consequences of anthropogenic global warming act themselves out on a much longer geological timescale. That is indeed the implication of the oft-repeated statement that humans today collectively act like a geophysical force on the planet. Thus, in contrast to the story that the seekers of climate justice tell, the story of the last 250 years, scientists tell a much longer story, a much longer history, I might say, when it comes to explaining the significance of human-induced global warming. How much longer will be visible from the very subtitle of a recently published award-winning book for the popular press, authored by David Archer, who is a colleague of mine in the geophysics division at the University of Chicago, a paleoclimatologist. And his book is titled The Long Thaw: How Humans Are Changing the Next 100,000 Years of the Earth's Climate. That is the kind of scale on which the scientists tell their stories. Or as in a recent book by the NASA scientist, the godfather actually of anthropogenic global warming in the United States, James Hansen, the book called Storms for My Grandchildren, the analysis moves easily between decades and thousands of years, where he says the speed of interglacial change is dictated by 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 timescales for changes of Earth's orbit, but this does not mean that climate change is inherently that lethargic